So for our next panel, I'm going to introduce our communications director, Sara Pohlmeyer. And she's going to have a panel discussion with some folks about how we tell the story of the labor movement. And y'all, Sara has been with us, how long? Huh? 6 months. She came to us from working with Congressman Greg Casar. And she had some big shoes to fill, which we're going to talk about at another time during this convention. But if everybody is not following us on all the social medias, you're missing out on the story of the Texas labor movement. And she is transforming the way we tell that story. And so I ask you to give her a warm welcome to Sara Pohlmeyer to talk about telling our story of the growing labor movement. Sara?
Hi, y'all. How are we doing? It's hard to follow President Schuler, but we're going to try our best, and we hope that we can learn a thing or two from these folks. So I'm going to go down the row, and Sara, do you mind introducing yourself?
Hi, I'm Sara DiNatale. I'm currently a business reporter at the San Antonio Express News. I split my time between covering energy and labor, but I've been a labor reporter in 3 states now. I've also covered lots of other business topics, but I've been most recently a reporter in Mississippi and Florida before coming to Texas.
All about the South.
All about the South.
Josephine?
Hi, I'm Josephine Lee, and I am a staff writer at the Texas Observer. And in my former life, I was a labor organizer in New York City, too.
Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael. I work with KETK News in Tyler, Texas. And last year I did a series on the biggest labor disputes in East Texas history and the lead up to Labor Day. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's what I want to start talking about first is some of the stories. You'll have all covered labor in Texas and elsewhere for a little while now. And so, Michael, can we start with you on just diving a little bit deeper into what brought you to want to cover East Texas labor history?
Well, it hadn't really been covered a lot in much detail because a lot of these stories and these unions in places like Lone Star at Lone Star Steel, Tyler Goodyear, or in Center with the sick chicken strikes in the 50s. You know, these stories have kind of not been shared since they even happened. And so I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of bring these stories back to the surface and get people thinking about that stuff. It's something that more and more people today are interested in. And so, it's kind of bridging the gap between what happened in the past, what's happening today, you know, because it's relevant, you know.
Absolutely. I think we all have some relevant stories to tell. So, Josephine, I know you've covered labor as well. What has been one of your favorite stories that you've gotten to cover?
Actually, it was a story that happened near me in Houston on the State Highway 288. This was a private tollway that was on a state highway, and I was struck by an incident that happened. A immigrant worker had fallen 85 feet to his death. There was very little in the news afterwards. In the news, we didn't know his name, we didn't know his background, but he was one of many who get injured on the job. And, you know, sometimes there's serious fatalities. And I was interested in, you know, what happens down a subcontracting chain where the super exploited, you know, are often on the bottom of that subcontracting chain. And, you know, a lot of times the contractors, the subcontractors, and the subcontractors, you know, are often not held accountable, and that's exactly what happened in this case. Was that the subcontractor got a slap on the wrist, and then the contractors deflected the blame to the subcontractors. The state, which owns the highway, also said that they didn't even know the contractor's name. And so, it's just, I'm sure everyone here has stories of that, how it's hard to hold the contractor accountable when there's this really long chain of subcontractors, and then how do you organize workers at the bottom of that subcontracting chain. And so I think I was interested in how to expose that system.
Absolutely. Thank you for working on that. Sara, what has been one of your favorite labor stories to tell?
Yeah, well, I'll give a couple quick shout outs to Texas stories I've done. Also on workplace safety, I've looked into the safety conditions at the Boring Company, and I've also done some work on construction worker safety and heat deaths. But during my time in Mississippi, I got pretty close with some farm workers in the Delta, and I spent a lot of time with them because I had sort of heard this rumor that there was an influx of South Africans coming on H-2A visas to work in Mississippi Delta farms. And I had just moved to Mississippi, but I knew that the Delta had a really high unemployment rate. So I was like, I'm surprised that they're even bringing in H-2A workers. And then I learned all the H-2A workers were white South Africans, if not completely, or if not mostly completely. I never met one who was Black. And when you talk to the local workforce, they said, yeah, we're actually getting displaced by these placements. And if you're familiar with the H-2A program, there's the Department of Labor does a formula every year, and it sets like a premium wage that those workers have to make. And the point of that is to disincentivize the farms from bringing in foreign labor they don't need, to prioritize local jobs first. Well, this is against the law, but the farmers were paying the white South African workers higher wages than their local Black workforce. So through an investigation, I was able to, get copies of pay stubs and Department of Labor reports and show that this wasn't just a couple farms, but a systematic failure among the Department of Labor of not tracking it appropriately, and also of those farm owners who were abusing the H-2A system.
Thank you for covering that. It's really important. I think a theme I'm just hearing right now, just from chatting with y'all, is that a lot of times our labor stories that get told are when there's a crisis, when there's a death, when there's a dispute of some kind. What do you think, what would be helpful in pitches from unions, or if we wanted to send y'all notes, like what would be, I guess, a good hook for a more positive labor story, maybe?
I think one of the things to consider is like what is happening in the news cycle at that moment. So like, I don't know, I'm just like thinking off the top of my head. And it's not necessarily positive or negative, it's just what's happening. So like tariffs right now, obviously how those are going to affect the supply chains. Well, if you're someone who's speaking on behalf of steel workers, you may have an interesting perspective that I would really like to hear, that I might not, when I'm on deadline, consider right away. So those are things to think of how you can, I guess, work the current news cycle to your advantage, but also help add in other voices to a national topic that everyone's talking about.
Absolutely.
One thing that was really useful for me, the last story in my series was about the unionization effort at Prysmian Group in Marshall, in Scottsville. That's the United Auto Workers local there. And Rick Levy actually did a live stream with Chris Hodge from the picket line when they were first trying to organize that union. And in the video, Chris basically told them the whole story. And that's before I wrote my article, that was pretty much the only place that story was online, right? About everything the company was doing and all the problems that the union had, and why they were trying to unionize. So that was a really helpful resource, even just because, it pointed out that this is Chris Hodge. This is the person who I needed to try and talk to develop this story, right? And eventually I was able to get a hold of Chris, and I got to talk to him, learn more about the strike and all of that. And yeah, that was really helpful.
So even sharing content is helpful.
Right. Creating, doing live streams, things like that. Sharing some of these stories because, you know, like in Tyler, for example, at Train, they make air conditioners. They picketed, and they're in a Facebook group that I'm in, and they talked about, you know, we're going to picket on this day, and so they shared all of these details and, you know, things like that. If you're having local events, I remember one of the people I talked to was Gene Lance with the Dallas AFL-CIO, and it's kind of far for us to cover, but he told me they were giving out barbecue, or they were having some kind of community event, right? Even things like that unions put on, you know, that's the exact kind of event a TV station would like to cover, you know, if you're giving away food to the community, or if you're having some kind of community event like in a local park or something like that. Not necessarily like, you know, just reactions, you know, this national event happened, here's what we think, you know, that's good. And I like the earlier, I think Emily announced the representative tracker. That's a really good resource because now you're covering every area in the state, right?
Absolutely. Josephine, anything to add?
Well, I work for a magazine, so it's a little bit different in that I'm able to do a lot of deep dives and investigative reporting, and I'm always looking for the human factor in stories. And so it's not just like, you know, reporting on press conferences or press releases, but I really want to know how different organizing activities or situations are affecting the people in the community. And so that is, you know, for the Texas Observer, you know, what we focus on.
So really showcasing maybe some members who have a really good story to tell.
To piggyback on that really quick, I think we kind of probably approach labor stories really similarly. And when you're thinking of prepping the folks who may be open to talking to reporters, I think it's making sure they understand what that means, that there's a level of vulnerability and like access that we're going to be looking for. And with some of these deeper dives, I know we both like to do, if you have like the receipts ready, oh my God, I will be so like, do you have copies of pay stubs to show like what the, you know, I did a story once on call center workers in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, and one of the things that they were trying to showcase was that like their healthcare was worse than the healthcare that they were helping people get on the phone. And so it's like, okay, well, show me, like, you know, and like they had a lot of those receipts ready. They had done, I think, their own internal report. And that makes telling those stories a lot easier because as a reporter, we have to protect ourselves. We have to make sure, especially if you're calling out a big company or a big contractor, you know, it's helps to be able to attribute those things to materials. You know, if you have a copy of a screenshot or a screenshot of a text message a manager sent that showcases the point, I mean, it's so much easier for me to tell that story with indisputable evidence rather than, you know, so and so said.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Take
I
the
agree.
screenshots.
Yeah, records really help. Official documents, things like that.
Now we know under the second Trump administration, and even in the last decade, I think we've seen Texas journalism struggle a little bit. Y'all are all part of that. Newsrooms sometimes are shrinking, sometimes they do grow too, and so that's good. But how has this current climate changed your jobs, and what do you need to make your jobs easier when covering labor stories? Anyone who wants to start?
I know for us, things haven't changed that much. There's not a lot of union activity in our area. You know, I think the two unions I've mentioned so far at Train and Prismian Group, I think they currently have a contract. And so, you know, since the Trump administration started, it's kind of, you know, not much has changed for us.
I'm sorry, do you mean like our newsroom itself, or the way we're like
I guess, how has your newsroom changed, but also has that put more work on you? What would make your job easier?
Sure.
Also covering things under a Trump administration.
Gotcha. Well, there's, two parts to that. So like I'm an example of someone who's splitting my time. ERCOT and the Texas grid keep me really busy, and labor is something that I also really like reporting on, but like my bandwidth it really just depends on the week. So I don't know, some understanding, I guess, is like appreciated. If I don't have time to do something, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm not interested. I'm sure there's plenty of times you've reached out to me that I couldn't do something, but you've always, kept that conversation opened or circled back, and like as long as you're circling back in like a respectful way and not like and I don't mean you as an individual, I mean in general. I appreciate that, because sometimes I'm a human, I forget things. So I'm like, oh, that is a really good point, and then I find a lull in my week. When we're looking at like the broader, just like covering labor under Trump, I mean, the things that I'm more keen on, is the intersection of immigration policy and workforce, and there's a lot that we're going to see unfolding, and like having sort of what I was speaking to before, like if you have folks that are willing to speak on that from their lived experience, and I'm not having, you're saving me time, I guess, from hunting around for some of those stories, like that is something I imagine a lot of reporters would appreciate. And I'm also just like selfishly and curiously like keeping tabs just on like what, like what's going to happen to the DOL's budget, like things like that are going to inform coverage moving forward.
Absolutely. While union popularity grows, what do you think your audiences should know about unions? Do they know about Texas unions? I guess kind of like an audience vibe check a little bit, but what are we seeing from readers right now, or from listeners, viewers, all of the above?
I think people are curious. Every once in a while, I think I see one of my stories, and we have a system, and it shows us like, oh, somebody's been reading this for 3 minutes, which is a long time for a web article. And so people are interested. Some people, I know Chris mentioned this, Chris Hodge with Prismian Group Union. He said that, a lot of people didn't know what the union was. I know, like Brent mentioned earlier, a lot of people thought it was illegal to join a union, or are completely unaware of what a union is. And I think that's the case in East Texas, just because, there aren't that many.
Well, I think for our readers, they want more labor coverage, and we were talking about before, there's really not a dedicated labor reporter for the whole state. In the whole state, there's not a dedicated labor reporter, and that's really a shame. And I have to split my time between education and labor if I'm able to. But yeah, I think that our readers really want more labor coverage, and we want to hear from you guys. What organizing activities you're going through. And to speak to the last question on the Trump administration, I was going to say that as far as like content right now, I think people are looking for leadership. It's shown that working class issues are really on the forefront of people's minds. His election also showed that workers have been more divided, than in the past, and a lot of them misled. A lot of them misled, and so they're looking for that leadership, and they're looking for the fighting examples that the everyday wins, right, that everybody has examples of, and so we would love to hear more of that.
Anything to
add? Just that I think we experienced a lot of the same unfamiliarity that you guys probably experience when you're trying to organize. I'm from Buffalo, New York originally. The first newspaper I ever worked for, the Buffalo News, has had a guild forever. So like my first experiences with a newsroom like that was just like a thing that, and I found a lot of folks in Buffalo grew up and their parents were just in a union, so you had at least some level of exposure. But for other folks, the first time they're hearing about what a union is like when they start their first job at Target and they'd get shown that video that, you know, get shown that like says why the union would make things harder, and you know, like goes, and that's really the only concept they have. So sometimes in reporting, like I'm finding that I have to just like break down some really basic principles just so like the conversation we're having, you know, they understand like what like sort of some of those building blocks are. And you know, I find that in my own industry when I've had colleagues at other newsrooms who have looked to organize where they just like they don't even know where to start.
Yeah, I totally agree. I remember having to write definitions for terms like scab or grievance mechanism, grievance machinery, things like that. Like some of those things are going to come naturally to people who are involved in unions, but you got to think about like if you barely even know what a union is, you're probably not going to know what a scab is or a grievance mechanism or something like that.
So some education here is needed for Texans overall, we're hearing.
I would say I mean, everywhere I've reported on labor in the South, like that's been the case. And I'm sure it's true for even places where unions are more prevalent.
Absolutely. What do you think is most interesting about our growing Texas labor movement right now? What would you like to be pitched, I guess? Josephine, can we start with you?
Sure. So I think, like I said before, we're looking for fighting examples. Sometimes, you know, you look through the news, it can be pretty bleak. A lot of bad news out there. But so we're looking for those fighting examples and those everyday wins. We're also looking for how workers are turning like the economic demands and, you know, going beyond just fighting for another $1 an hour, right, to political demands too. And, you know, I see a lot of examples of local unions connecting their workplace demands to the community, to health, to housing. And so, for example, you know, I follow the teachers union in Houston, and, you know, the teachers union has been, you know, very involved in not just like getting more wages for themselves, but also in pedagogy, right? And against high stakes testing, you know, working with community groups, and same with like the San Antonio Alliance that's here. And, you know, they've been not just like working around like teacher or education issues, but on affordable housing, because that affects the teachers, right? And then affects their students. And so there's like a really like holistic way that they have gone about like their organizing and, you know, working to create some of those transformative change. And I think as far as like other fighting examples, you know, a lot of the speakers have talked about how they're trying to bridge like this very divided workforce, you know, immigrant and non-immigrant across race. And so examples of that, you know, we're always looking for as well.
Super helpful. Love the shout outs.
Yeah, I think anytime you have like something tangible that helps illustrate some of those talking points that we might be hearing, and even if if it goes against one of those talking points, that's could be great too. I just, what is really happening? What are you seeing in your members' actual lives, and how is that correlating with ongoing policy? I mean, if you're seeing immediate impacts from budget cuts or like on the Department of Labor level, like, I don't know, the inspections that are supposed to be happening aren't happening as often. I have no idea if I'm just making up an example. Or, you know, like I said earlier, ongoing immigration policy, like that, those impacts are going to show up, and they may show up in ways that I'm not expecting, and your members are experiencing firsthand.
Yeah, I would definitely say local pitches, you know, anything that's coming through our area. You know, even, you know, my series that I did wasn't comprehensive. And so I know there are bound to be other stories. You know, one in particular I'm thinking of is how they got the union in at Goodyear in the first place, right? There's not a lot of info online about that out yet that I've seen. And so even like commemorating the anniversary of something or something like that would be interesting.
I think we're coming up. We have a little bit of time, so I might call an audible and ask. We maybe have time for like 1 or 2 audience questions. So if you have a burning question, please come up to the mics and we'll see if we can get to y'all. I want to ask, like, what is your general advice for these folks in this room? I mean, a lot of us here in this room have full-time jobs. They're not communications directors. They're trying to tell these stories a lot of times while juggling family, work, all these things. So what would be your one note of advice to folks in this room?
I don't want to talk to you. I want to talk to your work, like the workforce. And I'm sure you're great and wonderful. And I appreciate you making a connection. And I also, when I do talk to that person, I don't want to feel like I'm talking to someone who has been given a script, who's been overly prepped, even with the best intentions. You know, and I want to have just like a real human conversation. So just keeping those things in mind, and then also just remembering that different outlets have different priorities, and a pitch you might make to a local TV station is going to be different than a pitch to a newspaper or a magazine, and just keeping like those outlets differences in mind.
One thing we like is a phrase we like to say is new, now, next. So what's just happened, what's happening now, and what's going to happen next. Is there a board meeting coming up? We love covering board meetings and things like that. Things we can plan for in advance and stuff like that.
Generally, I would just say to send, picture stories, because I have not, I don't feel like I've heard from a lot of people in this room before. And so I would love to. And I'm sure you'll share our contacts.
Absolutely. We can definitely share contacts. Is there somewhere where people can follow you?
I'm on all the things. I'm very Googleable. Track me down. It's easy.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter. I've tweeted out a couple pictures of the last couple of panels. Yeah.
I'm more active on Blue Sky, but I do check X once in a while.
Do we have to call it X? Please.
For Michael, where can we watch your digital content that you create?
Oh, so I write for KETK.com. The series is called East Texas's Biggest Labor Disputes. So if you search that, I believe it's 8 articles that I wrote, and they're all linked within each other.
And you went on the Texas Standard for that as well,
Right. I did appear on the radio program Texas Standard, and you can find that on their website.
Any other audience questions? I think we've all got some homework. So thank y'all so much. Greatly appreciate you.
Thank you all.